Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Gale. Dr. Gale is regarded as a world expert on the medical response to nuclear and radiation accidents and has been omnipresent at such events since the 1980s. In 1986, he was asked by the government of the Soviet Union to coordinate medical relief efforts for victims of the Chernobyl disaster. In 1987, he was asked by the government of Brazil to coordinate such efforts at the Goiânia accident. And in 1999, similarly, he was involved in the Tokaimura nuclear accident. In 2012, Gale was also in Japan discussing the medical consequences of the Fukushima nuclear power station and doing some very important knowledge translation there. Dr. Gale, I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. It's been a long time coming. I saw some of your activity around the release of the HBO Chernobyl series, and ever since then, I've been wanting to chat with you. So I'm glad this has finally come through. Welcome to Decouple.
Thank you.
Now, I've done a little bit of a job summarizing some of your activities. Your bio is far too long to adequately summarize. A few highlights: 20 years as the chairman of the Scientific Advisory Committee on the International Bone Marrow Transplant Registry. I think you have 22 medical books to your name, over 800 scientific articles. But maybe I'll get you to self-introduce yourself, maybe on the more personal side. Pretend you're trapped in the elevator with my guests for about 60 seconds and go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, I feel sorry if they were trapped in an elevator with me, of course. So I'm a hematologist and oncologist. I treat people with cancer, various cancers, especially blood cancers. I'm also a molecular biologist, and in my laboratory, we molecularly clone genes that we think cause human cancers, especially leukemias. And then we try to develop treatments for all of these things. Apropos of your audience, one of the things we do is in treating people with leukemia and related cancers, we use very high doses of ionizing radiations.
So again, one of the big reasons I wanted to have you on was to get that sort of in the trenches view of what happened in Chernobyl. I've asked other guests. I think it's similar maybe to where were you at 9/11, but it took a few days for what had happened at Chernobyl to get out, and you were invited, I believe, by Gorbachev to come and assist. So I just want to sort of time travel and give you a chance to kind of recount that story. And then I want to get into the trenches with you in Hospital 6 and talk about the management of some of these patients. And that'll lead into, I think, a discussion about the overall broader health impacts. But just take us back to 1986 and maybe where you were when you heard about the accident and the phone call that you received.
Sure. To be precise, when Swedish authorities released information about the detection of radiation that they pinpointed to Ukraine, I happened to be jogging around the UCLA campus on my daily run. Immediately, realized, because I had been following Soviet nuclear activities. I also have many colleagues in the Soviet Union, but I was also, going to Russia or Soviet Union quite often. So I knew that this was a large accident. I didn't know at that time exactly how big, but I knew the limited resources that would be there in the Soviet Union. And I had contacts with Mr. Gorbachev over the years, and I knew I was well known by the KGB. So after a day or two, when I realized further what was going on, I contacted a colleague of mine, Armin Hammer, and who I knew, he and I had met with Gorbachev previously, and I asked him, to offer the resources of our international transplant organization. And I didn't really fully expect that in the midst of the Cold War, that the Soviet government would be open to having foreign help, especially when these are highly sensitive issues. So I was a little bit taken back when about 2 o'clock in the morning I got a call from Andrei Drubinin, who was the Soviet ambassador to the United States, and he told me that Mr. Gorbachev, wanted me to come to the Soviet Union, and he wanted me to come to Moscow. Of course, at that time, I didn't realize that the most seriously affected persons had been flown to Moscow. So, I mean, I grabbed my travel kit, and I was on a plane within a couple of hours to Moscow.
And so you were taken to Moscow to help provide care for some of these patients. I don't want to do too much of a kind of spoiler here, but I understand that you brought along a very important medication that we use now for people who have suppressed bone marrow when they have infections, febrile neutropenia. But yeah, let us know sort of, I mean, you said that there were some limitations to what the medical capabilities were in the Soviet Union. What did you bring along with you in terms of expertise and even equipment?
Well, initially, I just came myself. When I had a couple of days to assess the situation, I realized that we would try bone marrow transplants or hematopoietic cell transplants, and so I told my Soviet colleagues, we need to bring someone who's with expertise in tissue matching, tissue
Right.
typing. That was Paul Terasaki from UCLA. One of my deputies at UCLA, Dick Champlin. But then I thought I would really test the system. Remember, this is the midst of the Cold War. And I told them that I wanted to bring an Israeli scientist, my colleague Yair Reisner from the Weizmann Institute. And, they, I would say, somewhat hesitatingly agreed. Soviet Union and Israel had no diplomatic relations, but they finally agreed. Now, the treatment that you're referring to is the use of molecularly cloned hematopoietic growth factors. So we had been working on these for years in mice and rats, eventually in monkeys, and it was sort of nearing production in Basel, Switzerland by Sandoz, one of the pharmaceutical company. This was about 10 days or 2 weeks after I arrived. So I didn't bring this substance with me, but we, let's say, smuggled it into the Soviet Union in the suitcase of a Swiss businessman. We had it put into his suitcase after he checked in at the airport, and we had the KGB remove it from his suitcase before it was returned to him. And then we brought it to the hospital. Now, this drug had never been given before to human being. We're pretty confident of the dose from monkeys and things like that. But when my colleague Andrei Vorobiev presented this to the Politburo that we wanted to use this drug, they said, well, we don't want Soviet citizens to be guinea pigs. We don't want them to be the first people to receive this drug. So we were a bit discouraged, but then it occurred to me that I could give the drug to myself. And if I didn't drop over dead, the Soviet victims wouldn't be the first humans.
Wow.
So Vorobiev and I injected each other with this drug. He had a rocky time with it, but I was fine. We survived to the next morning, went back to the Politburo and said, okay, now they're not the guinea pigs, we were the guinea pigs. And we got permission to treat some of the victims with this molecularly cloned growth factor.
So what was Hospital 6 like? Again, this was, I guess, where they brought the most severely ill patients. How many patients were there? What's the environment like in that hospital? And I guess what were the main issues that those patients faced?
Okay, well, the hospital was attached to the Institute of Biophysics. And So it was a high security hospital that treated radiation. I mean, it was a general hospital, but treated members of the Politburo and also treated the occasional radiation victims from nuclear testing. We had battled several babushkas to get into the gate the first day. But it would look like an American hospital 50 years ago. Um, you know, very simple facilities, excellent physicians, my colleagues, very highly trained, experienced in small radiation accidents, but nothing on this scale. We had several hundred, more than 200 patients that were admitted to the hospital. We had the Army camped on the grounds. And my team, my Soviet American Israeli team, we concentrated on people who had the most severe bone marrow failure. There were other people with other injuries where burns or other things were predominant, but we try to focus our attention on the most severely affected people.
And I mean, what kind of condition were they in? Were you working through translators? Do you speak Russian? I mean, what was it like to interact with these patients?
Well, of course, that we had a large number of Soviet physicians with us. I speak some Russian, so but as your listeners may know, when you're first exposed to high doses of ionizing radiations, except for some nausea and vomiting, you feel pretty well. I mean, there's no immediate apparent adverse events. So these are healthy young males, predominantly healthy young males that are firefighters or nuclear engineers. So when you first encounter them, 4 or 5 days after their exposure, well, there's a couple of barriers. Firstly, most of them have no knowledge of ionizing radiations, and they, like most of the public, they're firefighters. The second thing is, healthy young people that feel well. It's a little bit difficult to explain to them what's coming. That their blood counts are going to fall, that they're going to develop severe gastrointestinal tract symptoms, things like that. So there's a bit of suspended belief. But we function pretty well as a team. And as you can imagine, again, in the midst of the Cold War, the fact that that an American physician had come to the Soviet Union, was there to help them. They were, of course, most appreciative, although I don't think they, fully understood the magnitude of their injuries or what was going to come.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds like the variety of different victims in this cohort, the folks with thermal and radiation burns, probably had pretty horrific injuries. And I understand these compounded thermal and radiation burns are particularly bad because what high doses of radiation do is shut down the rapidly dividing cells' abilities to regenerate, and hence the issues with the bone marrow in particular, but the gastrointestinal tract as well. But it's really interesting hearing you discuss these patients that felt okay for a few days. It must have been pretty tragic to sort of watch the course, particularly of those who didn't make it. I understand the bone marrow transplant was those were done on the most severe cases. Is that correct?
Sure. I mean, we would, the most in several issues. I mean, one issue is, of course, we're driven by our best estimate of the dose. If someone is exposed to 5 or 6 grays of radiation, we assume they can recover. We just have to keep them alive. When we start getting near 8 grays and things like that, they can recover in theory, but we may not be able to keep them alive long enough for that to happen. So we either need to have a temporary or permanent bridge of a graft. At least that was our thinking at the time. Now, the other thing is you have to remember there was a explosion, there was a fire, so release of chemicals. So we're dealing with concomitant injuries, overlapping injuries. I mean, we could, in theory and in practice, prevent death from bone marrow failure, but that person could go on to die from a chemical injury or a thermal injury. The problem is that these things might not be apparent early on. For example, damage to the lungs might not appear for a number of weeks. So we've got to make a decision. We can't wait 4 weeks to do a transplant. We've got to decide to do a transplant in the first week. So we need to estimate the dose, which is imprecise, and we need to estimate that the bone marrow is going to be the thing that's going to kill this person and not their lungs. And of course, that's error prone. You know, we do the best we can, as we do in all of medicine. And we know that some of the people that we transplant will be rescued by the transplant, but they're going to go on to die of pulmonary lung toxicity. But we just have to accept that uncertainty.
Right. So stepping back a little bit, I've heard it say that radiation is perhaps the best scientifically understood toxin, but at the same time, it seems like there's the largest sort of perception gap between the general public and expert knowledge in this field. How do we know what we know about radiation? Obviously, there's clinical experience. There's, I guess, the atomic bomb survivors. But can you walk us through a little bit about, in terms of that knowledge translation, how we know what we know, maybe and how that informed, your actions at Chernobyl and in the other nuclear accidents you were involved with?
Well, we have, as you say, a very substantial data set from, starting with Drosophila,
Right.
fruit flies, and working our way up to, mammals, to non-human primates, and eventually to man. The data sources, our most important source, of course, in my opinion, is the atomic bomb survivors, because we know exactly when they were exposed. We know pretty well what their dose is. And we have, very importantly, we have a control cohort. So in the atomic bomb survivor studies, we have about 90,000 exposed persons with known doses, but we also have 20 or 30,000 people that were residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but were not in the city on that day. So if we want to know how many, we can calculate how many excess cancers were caused by radiation, for example. We can calculate what dose, the relationship between dose and cancer risk, and so forth and so on. But our limitation, of course, is that this acute exposure happening in seconds at very, very high dose rates is to a Japanese population, not to a Caucasian population. Trying to move from that to what would happen to an American or European exposed to radiation under different circumstances. I mean, that's the challenge. So we have all these other data sets. We have people who are exposed to diagnostic radiations like a CT scan. We have people that get radiation therapy or various cancers, or even non-cancers like ankylosing spondylitis. And we have people living in different geological areas where their background exposures are quite different. And so the challenge, which is, incompletely resolved, we do the best we can, is to integrate all of these experimental and epidemiological data into some model that would predict how radiation acts and what the consequences of exposures would be. And it's extremely important, that we admit to uncertainties. You know, we there's substantial uncertainties in our risk estimates, um, and there are certain things we can't know. I'll just emphasize one of them, which is the so-called linear no threshold model. So, I think most people, I and most regulatory agencies and scientific bodies, we accept that any dose of radiation can increase your risk of getting cancer. But proving that, is pretty much impossible from an epidemiological point of view. But that is the most conservative position. That is the position that offers, in theory, the greatest protection to the public. So that's where we are. You might say flying by the seat of our pants to some extent, but that's where we are.
From my read of the literature, it sounds like we have a pretty decent sort of threshold at which we are able to measure increased cancer incidences. But as you said, below that, it's impossible to find those signals just because the base rate of cancer is quite high. But what sort of signals would we see in the Chernobyl survivors? I know there's different sort of cohorts. There's the folks that you were treating in Hospital 6, the liquidators, people that lived within a certain radius of the power plant. How do we study and understand the health impacts to those populations? And what have we seen in terms of the consequences? Because there's casualty rates that range from less than 100 to up to 1 million, depending on the study that you look at.
Yeah, well, imperfectly is probably the best answer. So, we're dealing with an extraordinary number of challenges. For example, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So now we have exposed persons in 3 different countries, in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Plus, we have 2 of those countries in a war. So, that doesn't help the situation at all. Now, in terms of, what's happened and what is credible after the Chernobyl accident. Now, the subset of patients that we had, the firefighters and engineers that got these very, very high doses, that, with a 40% background rate of cancer in all of us, 4 out of every 10 of us is going to develop cancer, 1 or more cancers in our lifetime. So, to say anything meaningful, you need a control cohort. So we simply don't have that for let's say these 200 immediate high dose victims. If we look at epidemiological data, one thing is quite clear, that there is a striking increase in the incidence of thyroid cancer in young people. These are children, let's say, that were approximately under the age of 16 at the time of their exposure. Their route of exposure is via drinking radioiodine contaminated milk. And thyroid cancer in children is extraordinarily uncommon. So when you have several thousand cases of thyroid cancer in young people, you don't need an epidemiologist or statistics to know that something is going on. So that's the easy thing.
In terms of that, the sickest cohort, those 200 or so victims of acute radiation syndrome, was there a cancer rate afterwards as they've been followed along much higher than 40%? Or what was seen in that really highly exposed group in terms of cancer?
Well, yeah, I don't think it's possible to say very much about that, because we have to account for other lifestyle changes. So, for example, many of these people had I would say, misimpression that they were fated to die from cancer. A common misimpression. And so they increased their smoking. They increased their drinking. And again, these, something like cigarette smoking, of course, is a hugely important risk factor for a variety of cancers, not just lung cancer, but a variety of cancers. So I don't think you can make any sense out of the 200 or so heavily exposed people. What we can say is there's a striking increase in thyroid cancer in children that were exposed. Now, there are two other reports that I think are dicey to analyze. One is a report done by some very good people of an increased risk of chronic lymphocytic leukemia in these liquidators, so-called people who were recruited to clean up or mitigate the accident. The studies are reasonably good. The problem is that, generally speaking, and based on the atomic bomb survivors and other data, this is the one form of leukemia that we don't think is caused by radiation. It's also a form of leukemia that we usually just pick up by doing routine blood tests. People don't have signs or symptoms. So if you have a population where you suddenly start doing a lot of blood tests, you're going to find more cases of chronic lymphocytic leukemia. The leukemias that were increased after the A-bombs, the acute myeloid leukemia, chronic myeloid leukemia, those leukemias are not reported to be increased. So we have this one report of an increased risk of this chronic lymphocytic leukemia, but it's statistically sound, but it is biologically less plausible. And there is a recent report of an increased risk of breast cancer. Again, without a proper control group, and with the myriad risk factors for breast cancer, such as age of onset of menses, age of onset as menopause, breastfeeding. We know that breast cancer risk is increased in women exposed to radiation. That's clear. But whether it's increased in women who were exposed to ionizing radiations from the Chernobyl accident, I would say is less certain. But I think the big message here is, there have been estimates, if you take a very small increased risk and multiply it by 400 million people, then you wind up with, 10,000, 70,000 extra cancers. All I can say is that there hasn't been a striking increase in cancer. And if we think about the atomic bomb survivors, I think this gives us a way to look at this. If you think of the atomic bomb survivors that have been followed now for 70 years, only 10% of the cancers in the atomic bomb survivors can be attributed to their radiation exposure. That is, 90% of all the cancers in the A-bomb survivors would have occurred anyway. So that's the extreme situation, and that's under ideal circumstances. So it's natural for anyone who was living in Ukraine or living in Belarus or living in Russia. It's natural for them, and even for their doctors, if they get cancer, to ascribe it to the Chernobyl accident. But this is very, very, very likely to be incorrect. But we'll never really know. We would never know.
We had a really interesting episode with Geraldine Thomas on the phenomenon of the Chernobyl children and the Chernobyl Children's Charity. And one of the reflections that we kind of mutually had is that, when something strikes like cancer, there's always the desire as a human being to know why and to have something to blame. And the kind of cruel reality that so many of these diseases are spontaneous, or birth defects are spontaneous. that it gives some comfort, I think, to parents to be able to say it was that. In terms of our stages of change of I'm forgetting them now, but rejection, denial, anger, getting to acceptance. That's a kind of vital part of it, and so it's very human, and I think a very human reaction to respond that
Yeah.
way.
Of course, this is human nature
Hmm.
to do that, but we neglect the randomness of cancer. Cancer is fundamentally a random event, um, and you can make your chances worse. I mean, you can smoke cigarettes or drink excessive alcohol, so you can increase your risk of getting cancer. But most cancers are random or stochastic events. When we look at twins, genetically identical twins, for example, both of whom smoke cigarettes, usually only one of the twins gets lung cancer. We don't see it in the other twin. So this is not environmental and this is not um, genetic. This is randomness. Now, human beings don't like randomness. These Chernobyl children with heart defects and so forth and so on. We have, I think, a huge amount of data that we could say with confidence that these birth defects and cancers are not related to the Chernobyl accident. But I'm always reluctant to say that publicly because, these children are getting better care. People are contributing money. If we think of the medical care they would have gotten in the old Soviet Union, um, yeah, their health problems are not related to radiations from Chernobyl. But I wouldn't like to discourage people from giving money
Right.
and helping these children because our job is to help children, not to worry about what's the cause of their problems.
Hmm. Hmm. What about the many of the reports, like the WHO Chernobyl Forum, talk about the main health consequence being the consequence of radiophobia, of people being afraid. What were some of those? What are some examples of those harms?
Well, I mean, one striking example was shortly after the accident, there was I would say, a mob scene in Kiev. Um, People, Kiev was not really in the direction of the radioactive plume. It's in the exact opposite direction of the radioactive plume. I mean, it's true that the Dnieper River, which flows by the Chernobyl nuclear power station, flows through Kiev, but radiation gets diluted out in water very, very quickly. But there was a mob scene of people trying to evacuate from Kiev, and I considered how could we stop that? And my decision was to bring my family to Kiev. So I had my wife and my two children meet me in Kiev, and we visited a bunch of hospitals. We did a bunch of television interviews, and I felt that bringing my family there, especially my children, would be the most effective way to stop this mass exodus from Kiev, where there wasn't really any radiological danger. But I think to fast forward to today, we're facing an extraordinary potential catastrophe with climate change. And these accidents, Chernobyl, Fukushima, have so soured the public on nuclear energy as a non polluting source that we're in a bind. I don't see any way that we can meet reasonable climate goals absent the use of nuclear energy. Um, and so maybe that is the most serious consequence of these accidents is For example, Germany, stopped its use of nuclear energy. Meanwhile, they're importing electricity from France that's made mostly by nuclear energy. And now they are really, we would say, up the creek, having become reliant on Russia for gas and oil. Japan markedly increased its carbon footprint after the Fukushima accident. So these kind of, ignorance is our worst enemy. And educating the public to the appropriate risks and benefits of nuclear energy and other radiation sources. That's our only hope for the future is education.
I know we just have probably less than a minute left, but I guess from a population level, given what you've just said, do you think that adherence to the linear no threshold hypothesis, as conservative and well-intentioned as it is actually causing a net harm in terms of exaggerating what the potential impacts of these accidents can be, and that leading us to revert to coal burning, for instance, or delay the phase out of fossil fuels?
I don't think so, because, the concept of a linear no threshold model is way beyond what the public can grasp. That it's radiophobia that is, because, the issue is, I think, a pretty fundamental one. Most of the dangers in our life we can see. If there's a hurricane coming, if there's a fire, if you're standing on the edge of a cliff. As human beings, we can perceive the danger, and in theory, we could try to mitigate the danger. But the problem with radiation is that you and I could be receiving a lethal dose of radiation while we're having this interview, right? And you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know. So it's beyond our perception as human beings. And, it's only human nature to fear these kinds of things that you can't perceive. So again, I have to go back to the notion of education, that all of us are being exposed to ionizing radiations all of the time. This is not a yes, no, it's not a binary. And I think we save more lives with radiation in the context of radiation therapy. We save more lives than we lose. So, but the challenge is to inform the public and inform political leaders, because political leaders play to their audience. Anyone who favors nuclear energy is immediately going to lose the forthcoming election. So, it's a long-term challenge for all of us involved in radiation and radiation biology and education and medicine. It's a steep climb. But I remain optimistic that if we could introduce this into high schools, in the long term, we could succeed. But perhaps I'm naive.
I do find it fascinating that experts like yourself and Dr. Geraldine Thomas, who were drawn towards studying Chernobyl, tend to be some of the most some people with very positive attitudes towards nuclear energy as a source, particularly in our fight against climate change. But listen, I know you have many other engagements. Thank you so much for making the time, Dr. Gale. A real honor and pleasure to chat with you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience.
Absolutely.
Take care.